Thank you all. I chose my own concept, and I chose it because I'm teaching a graduate seminar this semester, an experimental seminar that I'm calling The Future of the European Past. And the question asked by the seminar to the graduate students is to put together the historical and intellectual question of the status of Europe in the post-colonial period, together with their own professional self-questioning as entering the guild, so to speak, at a moment when the assumption of the validity of the question, as well as the resources needed to fill positions, are very much under discussion in my department as well as everywhere else. So I found this self-imposed assignment a fairly luxurious way of, in a way, freeing some of this thinking. Between May and October 1823, Franz Schubert, aged 26, composed and orchestrated the heroic romantic opera Fierabras, a story of two princesses and three soldier knights caught in love and battle between the forces of King Charlemagne and the fictitious Boland, Prince of the Moors. For the text, Schubert turned to Josef Kupelwieser, poet, translator, and secretary of the Kärntnertortheater in Vienna, where Schubert hoped the opera's premiere would take place. Schubert had met Kupelwieser through the latter's brother, the painter Leopold Kupelwieser, an adherent of the Christian Romantic so-called Nazarene movement. The Nazarenes looked to Rome both for aesthetic inspiration and as a model for a universal empire. For a model political architect of such a universal realm, they preferred Charlemagne, or Karl der Große, whom their spiritual guide Friedrich Schlegel had dubbed the architect of the West, der Baumeister des Abendlandes. Hence the plot of Schubert's opera. Set more or less around the year 800, when the east-west and north-south boundaries of Europe converged in northern Spain, the action unfolds with the victory of Charlemagne's forces over the Moorish armies and the capture of the Moorish prince named Fierabras. Fierabras is in love with Charlemagne's daughter Emma, whom he had encountered anonymously several years back in Rome, the place that signifies for all the characters the utopian location of all conflict resolution, political, religious, amorous. Emma, however, is safely in love with the knight Eginhard, and also under the protection of her brother Roland, who forms a strong bond of heroic respect for Fierabras. Meanwhile, by the way, Fierabras' sister Florinda is in love with Roland. In the end, the opera produces a, quote, happy end, or what we might call a happy end within the bounds of political and indeed cognitive possibility. The Moorish forces convert to Christianity, allowing Florinda to be united with Roland. The opera, however, chooses Eginhard over Fierabras as Emma's betrothed, leaving Fierabras as an object of respect and affection, but emotionally and reproductively alone. Fierabras remains avant la lettre a solid example of a category of respect and negativity that often carries the name of the non-European. This equilibrium has noble literary models. We might think, for example, of Lessing's play Nathan the Wise and its parable of the three rings, and thus the recognition of the equality and authenticity of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Natan's enlightened ecumenicism also stops short at the doorstep of marriage and reproduction. Its plot cleverly forecloses on the possibility of the sexual union of cultural antagonists. Unlike the West, which has been outed in the pages of Political Concepts by Susan Buck-Morse, quoting Naoki Sakai, as a mythical construction and a non-place, Europe is a place. If we follow the well-worn gesture of reminding ourselves that the German word for concept, Begriff, channels the verb begreifen, or to grasp, we may also remind ourselves that for conquerors like Charlemagne, Europe as concept unites with Europe as graspable territory. When geographical boundaries are closed or irrelevant, category and identity boundaries take over. Thus, the peace agreement that concludes Fierabras instantly produces intercultural marriage taboos, as does the ecumenicism that concludes Natan the Wise. In the case of Natan, the boundaries have been internalized, generating status differences among people living in the same place. Nationalism and confessional identity thus reinforce such status boundaries. The Jew is the non-Christian, non-German, or non-European. In the 19th century, the Muslim tends to fill that category for the early 21st. The idea of Europe has also trod an ambiguous line between grasping and embracing. The grasp reinforces boundaries, the embrace dissolves them, or so at least claims to. Be embraced, O millions, is Schiller's version of the universal embrace, perhaps the secular romantic version of Erasmus's pan-European Christianity. Erasmus's pan-Europeanism remains faithful to Latin and the Church of Rome as the optimal mediators of Christian differences. The world beyond Christianity is not of concern. It remains one of the great surprises of European and German intellectual history that Gotthold Lessing, 2 centuries later, should have taken up the question of the dignity of the Jews, and that he should have done so in a thoroughly unpersonalized and abstract manner so early as 1749 with his Lustspiel, the Jews, or Die Juden, well before the start of his friendship with Moses Mendelssohn, and perhaps the enabler of it. Anti-Semitism, on the other hand, was always satisfied to other the Jews as non-Christians, non-nationals, and non-Europeans altogether. Colonial and imperial Europe extends its grasp both of the world and to it with an impressive interdependency of knowledge and power. The goal is to Europeanize the non-European while retaining the clear status differential between metropole and periphery, colony and core, to use Anne Stoller's words, subjects and objects. The challenge to the historian is always to account for the objectification of the colonial or other object with that same figure's life as a subject. The history of subjectivity must be extended to so-called subalterns. We would agree that we do not easily agree on the political metrics of the globalization of European-inflected subjectivities. How far, the question then becomes, to declench the cluster of subjectivity and subjection. Schubert made a fascinating and aggressive decision here, as his young Moorish characters, Fierabras and Florinda, sing in musical and vocal styles that are virtually indistinguishable from those of the Europeans. The aesthetic differences are generational and not cultural. Charlemagne and the Moorish Prince Bolan do not possess the stylistic enunciatory finesse of their children. The global flow of Europeanness as a marker of subjectivity forms the central and controversial idea of Dipesh Chakrabarty in his book Provincializing Europe. His argument's first principle might be glossed as the identity of provincialization and globalization. The book begins with the fact of Europe's globality, with concepts as its chief agents and examples. I quote, concepts such as citizenship, the state, civil society, public sphere, human rights, equality before the law, the individual, distinctions between public and private, the idea of the subject, democracy, popular sovereignty, social justice, scientific rationality, and so on, bear the burden of European thought and history. This heritage is now global, the book asserts, and its wish is to renew that heritage from and for the margins. Europe has defined, and in turn been defined by the flow of power, capital, and culture from the heyday of the ancient Mediterranean. It is significant that currently Mediterranean studies, with both ancient and modern foci, has returned to paradigmatic importance as the more balanced micro-global alternative to the classical world that assumed Greece and Rome to form the polarity of Proto-Europe. In his poetically titled study Ancient Wisdom, Arnaldo Momigliano showed patterns of intellectual exchange between Hellenistic Europe and the Near East. Much more recently, Francesca Trivellato's The Familiarity of Strangers, the study of Jewish merchant families and trade between Livorno and Aleppo, offered a deeply researched and nuanced portrait of what she termed, quote, global history on a small scale. Both Momigliano and Trivellato mapped the multiple fissures and ambiguities of Europe and its internal as well as external others. In the 1820s, well before the advent of the new imperialism of the later 19th century, we can recall Philhellenists from Oxford, Cambridge, Berlin, and Moscow descended on Greece to help liberate it from Turkish rule. Their motivations were irredentist, occasionally revolutionary in the wish to salvage some practical memory of the generation of 1789, but also, quote, European in the long shadow of Charlemagne, intent on saving Europe from the infidel. Encounters with Turks were often racist, and so were many encounters with Greeks, who proved to be more brown-skinned and more linguistically compromised than many of these young classicists expected. Unexpectedly, the celebrities often did better than the rest in resisting these instincts, including Delacroix, who painted victims of violence with a realist brush, Byron, who fought, and Pushkin, who did not fight, but whose prior encounters with both Greeks and Turks during his period of exile in Odessa had shown him that modern Greeks were not emanations of classical, physiognomic, or poetic ideals. As Olga Litvak has recently observed, the Philhellenists played a significant role in inspiring early European Zionists and their similar combination of irredentism and the expansion of Europe. Much of that Zionist energy came out of Odessa with explicit reference to the Philhellenism that had inspired Pushkin. Not by accident, the Odessa-born, Heidelberg-trained physician and poet Saul Chernychovsky called his 1899 Zionist poem Before the Statue of Apollo. When George Eliot closed her 1876 novel Daniel Deronda with a clearly Zionist progress of its hero from his discovery of his Jewish lineage to his departure, quote, to the east, it is not entirely clear if how his leaving Europe also involves taking Europe with him. For Theodor Herzl, a generation later, it was indeed clear that the central argument of Alt Neuland was the wish for Jews to recreate the institutions and pleasures of Austrian life in peace. The premiere of Fierabras did not take place in Vienna, as intended, but rather in Munich in the context of the celebration of Schubert's centennial in 1897, after a delay of almost 75 years. The Vienna premiere did finally happen in 1988. Punctuality is not a known Austrian priority, as has often been noted. More importantly, an irresistible parallel emerges here with another event that did not take place in Vienna. I refer to Edward Said's delivery in 2001 of the annual lecture of the Sigmund Freud Institute, eventually given at the Freud Museum in London and published as Freud and the Non-European. You will remember the story. In July 2000, by his own account, Said was invited to give the annual Freud lecture in Vienna. By his own account again, he promptly accepted, having written about Freud and for many years been a great admirer of his work and life. Several weeks before receiving the invitation, Said had visited southern Lebanon with family members, where in a much debated and much disputed incident, he was photographed at the site of an abandoned Israeli border post throwing a stone. The incident was widely reported as a gesture of symbolic or real participation in the actions of Intifada, though most of this reporting accumulated after the onset of the so-called Second Intifada. Said's own account of the event does not completely clarify its intention or meaning. He writes, quote, "During our 10-minute stop, I was photographed without my knowledge, pitching a tiny pebble in competition with some of the younger men present, none of whom, of course, had any particular target in sight," end quote. In the same piece, however, Said describes his action as, quote, "having thrown a stone, an act rightly characterized as protected speech," end quote. Presumably, pebble pitching requires no such protection. Among the multiple repudiations and indeed hostile campaigns that ensued, the invitation to lecture at the Freud Museum in Vienna was withdrawn. The withdrawn invitation became part of the controversy. An article in the New York Times of March 2001 included a statement from the Museum Institute's chairman to the effect that Said's presence might offend Viennese Jews in the aggravated context of Jörg Haider's political prominence. At this point, the London Freud Museum stepped into the fray. Now published as a small book, the piece is largely a reading of Freud's last work, Moses and Monotheism. The circumstantial ironies of both event and text are rich. Freud wrote parts 1 and 2, and the first pages of part 3 of Moses and Monotheism in Vienna in 1937 and early 1938. Continued in June 1938 in London, almost certainly writing in the study of the house that then became the Freud Museum. That Said's Freud and the Non-European repeats Moses and Monotheism's path of exile from Vienna to London. Within and in many ways contingent on the circumstantial shell, however, resides Said's reading of Freud. In this reading, the category of the non-European occupies a structure and position parallel to the non-Jew. For the Freud that Said interprets, European culture and Jewish culture exist, and they exist centrally and overwhelmingly as bearers of consciousness, inheritance, and subject position. These existences are material and palpable, but reside below the threshold of articulation. This is the same kind of vexed presence that Said recognizes in music. the integrity of the European, the Jewish, and indeed the musical, exists precisely in the borderlessness between them and their formal opposites, namely the non-European and the non-Jewish. In this position, Said finds Freud's radicality as a cultural thinker. Freud, Said writes, had his own ideas about non-European outsiders, most notably Moses and Hannibal. Both were Semites, of course, and both, especially Hannibal, were heroes for Freud because of their audacity, persistence, and courage. He cites Freud's implicit refusal in the end to erect an insurmountable barrier between non-European primitives and civilization, and he locates, quote, the severity of Freud's argument in the principle of Nachträglichkeit, the return of the primitive, the return of the repressed. Freud's view of Moses as both insider and outsider is extraordinarily interesting and challenging, Said writes. He understands Freud's last text as an example of late style, or Spätwerk, in the company of Beethoven's final and, quote, bristlingly difficult works, apparently composed only for himself, this is an echo of Adorno, with scant attention to frequent and often ungainly repetition or regard for elegant economy of prose and exposition. Everything about the treatise suggests not resolution and reconciliation, but rather more complexity and a willingness to let irreconcilable elements of the work remain as they are, episodic, fragmentary, unfinished, unpolished. Like Beethoven's last work for Said, Freud's late style is obsessed with returning not just to the problem of Moses' identity, which is of course at the core of the treatise, but to the very elements of identity itself, as if that issue, so crucial to psychoanalysis, the very heart of the science, could be returned to in any way that Beethoven's late work returns to such basics as tonality and rhythm. As if the issue could be returned to, this is Said's most trenchant and, at this point, most cryptic proposition. Christopher Bolas, in his introduction to the published Freud and the Non-European, cites Said's essay Reflections on Exile and its advocacy of, quote, a scrupulous subjectivity that can be cultivated by the exile, quote, provided that the exile, this is Bolas quoting Said, provided that the exile refuses to sit on the sidelines nursing a wound, end quote. In the Freud lecture itself, however, Said speaks of the secular wound from which there can be no recovery as, quote, the essence of the cosmopolitan. To the extent that the European can coexist with a non-European as components of fluid identity models or non-identity models, Said's humanism comes close to Chakrabarty's global flows of European models. The question remains as to whether or to what extent this model of global flow or cosmopolitanism can incorporate a radical anti-European position, such as that of Frantz Fanon, whom Said cites, albeit briefly, as attacking, quote, the whole edifice of European humanism itself. Said quotes Fanon's call for the invention of the new man, whom Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. He does not address or ask us to consider the question of the European linguistic, cognitive, and indeed professional castes of Fanon's own capacity to think and speak. This may be a kind of forbidden question, a question that cannot be asked as it approaches the condition of a complete impasse in the creation of voice and subjectivity. There is a tension, a certain contrapuntality to Said's favorite trope, between the basic argument of culture and imperialism, including the chapter The Empire at Work on the Cairo commission and premiere of Verdi's opera Aida, and Said's own very personal memoirs of his youth in Cairo, where experience actually accrues through music or musical experience. The possibilities of cultural mediation and the formation of, quote, scrupulous subjectivities might be enacted. The Cairo of Said's youth, so he recounts, was to a great extent colonial Cairo, a series of European enclaves, strongly marked by metropolitan cultural forms and tastes, from the concert hall, he says, to the red light district. This European Cairo dominated until at least 1952, the year of Nasser's coup against the grotesque reign, Said's phrase, of King Farouk. Said offers the following understated but extraordinarily rich autobiographical vignette. Quote, Said, Both my parents were Palestinian and Protestant, he from Jerusalem, she from Nazareth. My guess was that both their families had converted in the 1870s or 1880s. My father is from the Greek Orthodox Church, my mother is from the Greek Catholic or Melkite. The Saids became stolidly Anglican, whereas my mother's family, slightly more adventurous, were Baptists, many of whom later studied or taught at places like Baylor and Texas A&M, end quote. Said's Cairo was a, quote, crowded but highly rarefied cultural maze, whose musical offerings included annual opera and ballet seasons, plus concerts by the Berlin and Vienna Philharmonics. Giuseppe Verdi's Cairo career may be headlined by the 1871 premiere of Aida, but that is only the headline to a story of abiding density in an extremely varied and very dense series of performances, and more dense, in fact, into the 1950s, largely because of the commutability between Italy and Cairo and the sanctioning of formerly fascist singers who were, in fact, not invited to the United States. The Cairo of Said's sanctioned childhood education found its foil in his movement through the, quote, disorderly palimpsest of Cairo's carnivalesque history, with its, quote, fluent passages of adventure, sexuality, and magic, the cohabitation of Islamic, Mediterranean, and Latin erotic forms, to which the Europeans in the city were attracted, and which their colonial discipline and self-discipline strove to keep under wraps. And then another quote, the traffic between Europe and this Cairo is what we are beginning to lose as Nasser's Arabization, Sadat's Americanization, and Mubarak's reluctant Islamicization face its transactions altogether. And then a fairly long example. Quote again, Said speaking, I saw the last and for me the best result of the traffic in Ignaz Tigerman, a tiny Polish-Jewish gnome of a man who came to Cairo in 1933, attracted by the city's warmth and possibilities in contrast to what was coming in Europe. He was a great pianist and musician, a wunderkind student of Leschetizky and Ignaz Friedman, a lazy, wonderfully precious and bright-eyed bachelor with secret tastes and unknown pleasures who ran a conservatoire de musique on the Rue Champollion just behind the Cairo Museum. The CV of Theodor Leschetizky speaks to the musical flow of Habsburg and Hohenzollern Central and Eastern Europe of the 19th century, itself a predecessor of the more global and cultural flows of the 20th and 21st. A Pole with a Viennese father and German mother, Leschetizky studied in Vienna with Czerny and performed a Czerny concerto as a child with Mozart's son Franz conducting. Took lessons in competition from Simon Schechter, who had given Schubert a lesson and later taught Anton Bruckner. In later years, Leschetizky vacationed with Johannes Brahms in Bad Ischl, where his descendants apparently still live. Ignaz Friedman, born Solomon Freudmann in Krakow, studied with Leschetizky, Hugo Riemann, and Ferruccio Busoni, lived in Berlin until 1920, and thereafter in Copenhagen, until a concert tour to Sydney allowed him to escape Nazi Europe. The portraits of these canonic figures show that what is European is in fact also peripatetic on a scale geographically smaller, but not existentially so, than what we refer to today as the global. In recent years, several music historians and pianists have restored some attention to Tigerman, including Alan Evans in New York and Samir Rafat and Salim Sednawi in Cairo. In a 1998 essay called Western Classical Music in Kulthum's Country, Salim Sednawi offers a rich survey of musical culture in Cairo across the 1952 divide. His argument throughout is that the European tradition forms an integral dimension of indigenous taste, notwithstanding the colonial aspect of its dissemination. Sednawi traces this tradition from the Napoleonic invasion through the 1869 opening of the Cairo Opera House to the pre-1948 visit of the Palestine Symphony Orchestra under Toscanini and multiple visits of the Berlin Philharmonic. Sednawi concludes with a survey of contemporary Egyptian musical figures and a plea for the preservation of European-Egyptian musical exchange through the composition of new works relevant to the musical legacies of both. Said concludes his memoir of Cairo, and I'll conclude here as well, again with Tigerman, and here is this, in my view, exquisite passage. Quote, my own last symbolic memory of Tigerman was watching him at his conservatoire, listening in 1959 to his most gifted student, a stunningly fluent and accomplished young married woman, a mother of four, who played with her head completely enclosed in the pious veil of a devout Muslim. Neither Tigerman nor I could understand this amphibious woman, who with a part of her body could dash through the Appassionata and with another venerated God by hiding her face. She never said a word in my presence, although I must have heard her play or met her at least a dozen times. Tigerman entered her in the Munich piano competition, but she didn't do well in that overheated and cutthroat atmosphere. Like Tigerman, she was an untranslatable emanation of Cairo's genius. Unlike him, her particular branch of the city's history has endured and even triumphed. For a brief moment then, the conjunction of ultra-European and ultra-Islamic Arab cultures brought forth a highlighted image that typified the Cairo of my early years. Where such pictures have since gone, I don't know, but part of their poignancy for me is that I am sure they will never recur. And I would end with just a couple of comments, really as a kind of confession of my own cathexis to this passage of Said. It seems to me there is no question that this is a highly self-aware indulgence in a kind of Orientalism. Clearly, Said was well aware what and how he was writing here. I think he was also aware of the troping of certain motives from Baudelaire, in particular the cygne or the swan, as this kind of emanation from a kind of vexed and overly dense Paris. And finally, I think he was aware of the performance of his own melancholy, but a melancholy not as a performance of loss, but rather as a mode of knowledge.
Thank you very much for both thought-provoking talks. I have a question for both speakers. If we need to rethink Islam, indeed Europe, outside of the whole series of problems that go under the heading of Orientalism, should we not begin in the first place by getting rid of this sort of mismatch between a religion, Islam, and a geographical entity, be it the West or Europe, in the first place? Because it seems to me that this is not just a problem, but it's the problem. And it's interesting indeed that if one looks at the program, right, coming from nowhere, it immediately strikes the incongruity in all the sessions, the fact that Islam is the only religion in the program, and that it's paired with Europe, right? So of course this is done critically on purpose, but we can say that the same problem that Orientalism faces, that is reproducing the very same category that it's trying to dismantle by trying to dismantling, is being reproduced in this panel, where we try to get rid of this geographical mismatch precisely by endorsing it. So, of course, the problem is not simply. I'm not sure that Europe, in contrast to the West, is something that is there, because I mean it's an equally, at least in my view, it's an equally ambiguous, free-floating things. Of course, we've been talking about it for a long time, but I think the problem is the same. But more in general, it seems to me the problem is, what are we doing when we say West? It seems to me the problem remains West of what? We're doing two things when we say West, and I'm still so puzzled that the word is still being used. I mean, constantly on the New York Times, almost every day. Whenever there is Islam, there's a reference to the West. Or if it's not the West, it's Europe, right? Now, what we do when we say West, we are doing two operations. First, we transform something that is spherical, because in a globe, properly speaking, you cannot say East or West. So we transform something that is spherical in a bidimensional map, right? But which kind of map? We don't put China at the center of this map, we put Europe, right? So we are completely stuck whenever we say West into Eurocentrism, but not understood as racism, or technically speaking, understood as looking at the things from the point of view of a bidimensional map, which has Europe at its center.
Come to the question, please.
Yes, so the question is, are we really provincializing Europe, and can we provincialize Europe if we still have maps and mismatch between geography and religion?
You're absolutely right, but there are about the mismatches, but where I would resist the correction would be at the limits of how history would correct itself. In other words, there are incongruities that are historical, that are not imposed by conceptual mappings of my own or other people's. So that the extent to which categories are national, religious, cultural, and geographically are in a way produced through historical realities, and those realities are difficult to correct. Where I think a category such as Europe remains potentially interesting, and I think more interesting than the West, and I was using the West just as a kind of brief transition and foil, I'm not really concerned with it, has to do with the capacity to self-correct by engaging in advocacy of the opposite of the default position, or the opposite position from its own default position, so that Europe becomes a correction of certain nationalist or geographical or, in fact, monocultural models, whether those monocultural models are Christianity, Catholicism versus Protestantism, one region versus another, or ultimately Christianity and Islam, which is still the case in debates about contemporary Europe. So Europe is a category that is somehow more interesting because of its desire to transcend some of these own boundaries, whether they are geographic or not. So I think there's still some kind of critical power in the category, and just as the category cannot get away from the place, even though it does get away from the place, it also can't get away from the incongruities that are produced historically. So I don't think we can clean these things up. I don't think we can be historically accurate in cleaning them by imposing. So we can't make order out of identity positions. I think it's impossible. You just create another form of kind of violent abstraction.
Yeah, I mean, I would say something probably overlapping as well. I mean, it seems to me the fact that I've deconstructed something doesn't mean it goes away, right? So the fact that I have a certain skepticism towards the kind of synthetic thing that is Islam or that is Europe, and that I can demonstrate the ways in which each of these is, a kind of fiction, a kind of regulating fiction in all kinds of situations, doesn't mean that they don't have phenomenal reality, really, right? And that they don't have social life. So, and neither of them. I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right to be skeptical. And when you say religion, maybe on the one hand, continent on the other. Is that the term you use for Europe? Continent, geographical. Yeah, geographical continent. But they're not exclusively that. I mean, you could even say, of course, that Islam is becoming in many ways racialized now. In the post 9/11 era, as we know. I'm not saying anything original here. In the way that Europe is also obviously racialized, not just a kind of and has long been, not just a kind of geographical designation. So I don't think there are any clean terms. I don't think there are any terms that don't present us with these problems, and the point is to keep returning to the problems and not lose sight of them. The problems you call Orientalism.
Thank you both for your papers. I have a question for Amira, mainly because I was trying to follow at the end and you skipped the final paper, so I think this is going to be an opportunity, hopefully, for you to say something. I can read the remaining
page now.
Let me just ask the question and then see if it. But I was very interested in this sort of reconstruction of an orthodoxy of Islam that you brought out in reading Sayyid Qutb. And in particular in the ways in which there were sort of these moments in what you were saying that could go another way in what he said. So for example, what you need is to go back to the Meccan period, and Muslims as an oppressed group could mean something very different, it would seem, than what he was maybe trying to do. So I think you were hinting at that, but that for example Muslims wouldn't in Muslim societies be able to do it, but in conditions of oppression, or that other groups that are considered heterodox would be the ones that would actually be able to do this. So I was kind of interested in pushing that a little bit because I could sort of see it happening, and I was also interested in what you were saying about the reconstruction of orthodoxy under colonial conditions in particular.
Yeah, but that was sort of the concluding page that I didn't get to, the last, I think. Is this actually working?
It's working.
Is it working? Okay.
Maybe it's good.
Good. Yeah, so that's sort of the kind of concluding. I just a few conclusions at the end very quickly, really telegraphing a broader argument in some way. But Qutb, and I mean, he's very interested in the Muslim as minority, as oppressed minority, because the only Muslims he knows are an oppressed minority, meaning like-minded people. His torturers are not Muslim. The pharaoh who rules over Egypt is not a Muslim, right? The whole sort of equating of Nasser with the return of pharaohism, and that entire line of thinking that emerges out of his own work and his various colleagues and predecessors in the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim as minority is a very profound notion for him. That to enter Islam is to enter a state of perpetual self-sacrifice, and at most to be able to present yourself an example precisely in your suffering and your self-sacrifice to the universe of the infidels who are all around in this nominally, supposedly Muslim society. But as I said, the Muslim kind of opens up an aporia really, because it's a structure of undecidability. If there are no Muslims in the world, then why begin with a Muslim society or something of that sort? So the very notion of the Islamic community is a kind of impossible notion in his writing. Okay, the second thing that you mentioned, which is kind of really the larger point of this argument in some way, and of this close reading of this one text. The text is not an accidental choice, by the way. It's an enormously influential, maybe the most important work of Islamist apologetics in the 20th century, widely circulated, widely translated into every language in which Muslims live their lives. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And that was the purpose of the writing. He extracted much of it from his 30-volume commentary on the Quran. Okay, and this is a little book. I mean, it's more than a pamphlet, but it's a short treatise. So it's an important work in that regard. What I was trying to say is that the largest sort of impetus is to argue against certain forms of post-secularist thinking today. Okay, and really a kind of widely held assumption across the spectrum, from Christopher Hitchens to to the new anthropology of Islam, to Sabah Mahmood, let's say, or Talal Asad. Is Talal here? I'm sorry, it's not here. The unspoken and very often spoken assumption that political Islam is a return to the Islamic tradition after the sort of displacements of the colonial moment, after the dislocations of the colonial moment. This represents an attempt to return to some conception of the Islamic society, etc., etc. I mean, this is quite widely held view, that the political Muslims, the Islamists, are there is an attachment of a claim to authenticity, and that's certainly part of the Islamist discourses. And my whole sort of really attempt is to show the way in which this supposed return to tradition is the most radically Protestant devastation of tradition in all forms, under the conditions of the colonial state, its institutions, and its epistemologies. And hence this establishing of the law, right? Think of the law in the colonial state. Sorry to miss the early discussion of law, and it's part of it. And that essentially gets applied to the Islamic material, and this neo-orthodoxy is fundamentally neo-orthodoxy. That's the argument I'm trying to make, rather than an orthodoxy, and how it is produced, and how it is transmitted and reproduces itself. Sorry, didn't go that long.
Interesting. I was very impressed by your talk, and I want just to make a remark. Well, the title is Islam.
Could I actually ask
Yeah.
people to identify themselves since
No,
I
no,
don't
no.
know anyone?
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Barbara Gassan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh my.
The title is Islam, and then
You know.
Yeah.
and then during your talk, you travel from one word to another. Of course, one Arabic word to another one. Could you theorize a little bit?
That's a Barbara Gassan question,
Yes.
obviously.
Because when you were talking, I was thinking of an idea we all had. When I say all, I mean Jacques Lesra. I mean also Bashir Diagne, Suleiman Bashir Diagne. Is to have a reflection about the words that constitute the three monotheisms, and to compare them.
Mhm.
So
Interesting process.
so I just wanted you for this project, but if could you tell us more about the link between Arabic language and Islam? What you were saying
Yeah,
about
it's
that.
such an enormously interesting question, obviously, and I really can't claim to be the right person to try and map that space for us. But I don't hesitate to speculate. I can speculate in the spirit of this conference. I would say that when I was talking about Qutb's conception, and it's a widely shared conception. This is not just unique to him, partly because of his importance and influence and dissemination of his work. A widely shared set of problems, let's say, than even positions. But when he talks about the Ummah, when he talks about the Islamic community of believers, right, the whole problem is what happens to the socius, what happens to all aspects of social life, which the moment of conversion is meant to overcome and to cancel out in a totalizing fashion, right? You forget your kin, you forget the kin structure that you're part of. You forget everything. It's a new birth, really, right? So, and of course, the question of language is very, very important there. Language is you're not being asked to leave behind your language, but it's also it's a renewal of the language itself in certain ways. This Islamic conversion, this moment of creating the Islamic community. It's a transformation, obviously, of Arabic as well. And again, as I said, I'm not a scholar of these matters, but I know that this is very carefully argued by many scholars. The innovation that takes place in Arabic linguistic practice, right, in the formation of the early Islamic communities. My method here was, as I said, to think about constellations. Each of these terms, not as a concept, not as a belief, but as a kind of radiating center which brings around it a whole bunch of other things in a certain order, constellation in that sense, that therefore affects each of these elements in a certain way. And if you change the order, the meanings change really dramatically. So I was thinking of this, the central notion, that of the monotheistic confession, Tawheed. I mean, if you want to find a center, you would say that's the center itself. And I was trying to understand the way in which a whole series of other terms that are clearly operative in this rethinking of the nature of Islam and being Muslim, a very modernist account of it, right? The way in which each of these terms, which have a certain importance in its discourse, has its own kind of radiating power that draws other elements towards it in certain arrangements and gives them sort of particular kinds of significance. In terms of the language of the Quran, of course, I mean, you can't translate the Quran, right? The Quran is untranslatable, literally. When you give a version of the Quran in another language, you don't call it a translation. I mean, that's considered seriously heterodox. And what you're offering is a commentary in another language. Tafsir is usually the word, but there are other terms depending on what kind of commentary it is. So if you want untranslatables, this is the mother of all untranslatables. And yet, of course, precisely in that forbidding of translation is a flourishing of the process and event of translation, right? I mean, so that is to say, attempting to bring the semantic spaces of certain terms and constellations that I've described into other natural languages. I mean, that's an original problem in the spread of Islam, obviously, historically, but given a particular form in the modern moment with thinkers like Sayyid Qutb. He's of course also relying on people who didn't write in Arabic massively. His biggest influence probably is the Indian thinker, Islamist thinker. Really, the Muslim Brothers is I would say more or less it's the prototype for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the Jamaat Islami in South Asia, in all the countries of what was originally founded in the 1920s in North India. Anyway, and so that's already being made available. I mean, people are hungry for this work, which is written in Urdu, and they are hearing about it in Egypt. And there's a whole project now. How do we turn? That's not a normal route of translation from Urdu to Arabic, And so that produces its own sort of scenarios of translation, requiring translation in that direction, whereas we're familiar with translation in the other direction. But yes, I mean it's a foundational question in the kind of global account he is giving of the Islamic community. At its heart, it's a kind of project of translation.
Just to add very briefly to this fascinating response, that I think the translatability, untranslatability paradox is really the fundamental principle of the humanities. I would even go so far as to say it's a competency test for capacity in the humanities. In other words, if you get this problem of the translatability, untranslatability, and tension, you can go further. and most American social scientists don't get it. And it's a very, very interesting kind of cultural capacity, incapacity. But I think it's also very closely related to what I would call the kind of contingency of concepts, or the historical and cultural contingency of the concept. And this is to return to its kata, right? I mean, to return to this earlier question about, in other words, what we call religion. In other words, just as there is this kind of, what I'm very moved to hear you talk about is a certain Protestant version of kind of orthodoxy. There are categories which we assume to be real material categories, but which are in fact the inventions of Protestant scholarship. Religion as a category or as a concept is precisely this kind of invention, which is a deeper source and a different kind of source of the church-state separation, so to speak. But in that context, which does not impact on the argument of Jean's paper, which also has a context, but the actual concept of religion is highly specific and possibly not applicable, not accurate, which then also problematizes the incongruities that we talked about a minute ago.
If we go back to the problem of untranslatability of Islam and we relate translation to monotheistic religion, we should go back to the translation of the Bible into Greek and Aramaic, which is the condition for the possibility of Christianity. So translation and monotheism goes all the way back. I have a special temporal question for both of you. I mean, space and time. Michael, you mentioned two meeting spaces, or two spaces in which Europe, the imaginary Europe and its imaginary other mix. One in the literature, or in the literature and in music, with Schubert and Lessing, and one in Cairo through Said. Now these are very different spaces of interaction, and I wonder if you can say something about it, the way you moved from the one to the other, maybe back and forth, or maybe it's just one-way street. I'm not sure. And about time, one of the striking points I think that came from your description of this political theology, I would say, is its peculiar temporality. It is directed to the past, to early Islam. It is directed to the future, kind of waiting till the society will be ready for the conversion, and it empties the present. Now, I wonder if this is a true description, and if you can use it in order to compare this version of Islam to some of its rivals, especially the Shia.
I couldn't really answer the last question, I think, very adequately, except that all things Shia are, of course, the antagonists in Qutb's discourse. So I would really have to think more about, about the messianistic aspect of temporality and how that would figure here. I would have to think more about that. The sort of extended wait for end times and return of the Messiah figure, as it were, the Imam, in Shiism, that is. So I'd have to really think more about that. I don't think I want to put my foot in my mouth about that. As for his temporality, you're absolutely right. I mean, the present appears to be a strangely empty place, actually. And at the very least, a deeply degraded place. I mean, a place of a kind of cosmic ignorance. It's not just a sort of we're living through bad times. No, it's really in a cosmic scheme of things. It's unbelievable where we are somewhere. And the past, but the past is not on a historical continuum. I mean, it's the origin. It's the moment of origin. And to the extent that you can talk about the past historically, you would have to say that it's a series of degradations. But he's not even talking about the past historically. I mean, in some ways I could say there's a kind of classicism here, rather than a historicism, where there is a return to an origin that has never been repeated, and yet the whole goal is to somehow recreate it and repeat it in some future. And the affective labor of that, which is actually somatic, right? I mean, just the clarity of thinking about the physical suffering, literally, of bodies and minds and collectives of persons, that will be necessary in order to reach this. I don't want to say classical, because there's no kind of, obviously, raises aesthetic issues and all that, and that's very problematic. But this past, which is discontinuous with the present. It's not as if we've arrived in the present by a series of steps from the past. It's a fall, it's like the fall, and it has just happened once and for all. And the only thing that we can do now is to wipe out everything that has come in between, everything that is there, all of history, as it were, in order to capture the origin of it.
That's a wonderful place to end.
Is it really?